The definition of the word culture is the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. This has power, and behind it, the very definition of a culture is therefore surrounded by achievement. Achievement has connotations of pride, and this is what people as a race strive for. They take pride in things we do. Some people do things differently to others, and this is why different cultures emerge as time goes on. Ever since the second car was built, people were racing them. Cars for a long time have been symbols of wealth, and until recently were only available to higher classes. However, with the days gone of cars and coffee being filled with £500,000 concourse sports cars, is there still a culture left? The 1940s was arguably the birth of car culture. More people began to gain access to cars, and through this they began to be used more often and by a much more social crowd. In the 1940s, people called moonshine runners began to transport their moonshine in cars to disguise it from the police. Once the police at the time had begun to catch on to this, the runners started modifying their cars. They had secret compartments hidden in the cars to hide the moonshine, and they also began to fit bigger engines and better handling parts. They then started to meet up in car parks to look at each other's work and admire the engineering and methods that were used. It was only a matter of time until they began to race them against each other. At first they started racing in dirt ovals, which eventually turned into a sport called NASCAR. This is still very popular in America to date, and it was the rise of car culture to the social classes in Southern America. In the 1950s, with NASCAR beginning to thrive and going well, the businessmen and high classes fancied their own car event. This was when the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance was created. This was an event for strictly unmodified cars in better than showroom condition. The event was so elite that in the opening year they only had 3 dozen cars show up. The best in show went to an Edwards R26 Special Sport Roadster, a car which now has an estimated value of $143,750. The year after it received great success and had a much larger turnout. This was then followed up by a change in venue due to the event's growth in 1952. This was also the first year where the cars were ordered in price. The Pebble Beach event is still very much alive and is filled with cars valuing up to and beyond £13 million. The car culture at this time was still on the up. Throughout the 1950s, each successive year, various classes and disciplines were put into Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. As it was growing, it was getting copied all around the world. This era was also the dawn of cars and coffee, a bring anything you want to car show in a cafe car park. This was great for business in the cafe, and it began one of the first ways to monetize off the car culture. The 1960s sparked the merge between the youth culture and the car culture. With drive-in films beginning to become popular and also drive-thrus, the world began to centre itself around the car. This meant they became more accessible. 1960s was when the Mini was first introduced, a cheap car which could be modified and changed. This was appealing to the youth culture as it allowed more personalisation. This was also the era of the Mustang and when cars really took off with competing manufacturers and celebrity endorsement. People wanted cars to look cool and to have a certain image. This cross of youth culture and cars created events such as cruises. This is where the cars would drive together around a well-known cruise loop and would stop off at a destination. This was completely alien to the parents of the youth at the time, as they didn't understand why you'd want to drive for no reason. The license became a rite of passage for the younger generation, where they could finally have privacy and go out to do their own thing when they wanted. This was when cars became a fashion and a hobby. Teenagers began to buy magazines and car parts to individualize and show their passion. As the 1960s progressed, the teenagers began to modify the cars to compete in drag races on the cruises. The drag races were arranged to happen on street. It was a quarter of a mile where you raced from start to finish, and the fastest car in a straight line won. This trend led on into the 1970s. The 70s was an excellent time for car culture. The modifying trend at the time was to make drag racing cars. These cars were cars where the back end would be lifted to fit bigger, wider wheels onto them and would put down well over 400 brake horsepower. At the time, these amounts of power were kept to the supercar royalty, with the likes of the most iconic 70s supercar, the Lamborghini Countach, only reaching the 400 mark. 70s became the boom point for the Formula One. Formula One had been around for a while, however it had never been quite as big as it was in the 70s. The sport became iconic and people began to transform it from just racing drivers into sports personalities. People such as Niki Lauda and more famously known James Hunt turned the sport into a business. This rivalry was so famous that in 2013 a film called Rush came out in dedication to their sportsmanship. Formula One and other televised car racing meant people who didn't drive around or even own a car were involved in the car culture. This bred more people into the culture, with kids who wanted to grow up to be racing drivers and were obsessed with cars. Formula One has been consistently hammered with rules and regulations from this point on. This meant that although racing is no longer as exciting to watch as it once was, it's still very prestigious and attracts fans from all over the world. The next drastic change in car culture came in the 1980s. This culture was very different to that of previous years, as there were no advancements in cars or culture for younger people, and the drag racing and power modification stayed the same. One change, however, was a new class of car was created, super saloons. These cars were lifesavers for people who were having to ditch the Porsche for a sensible family car. This all began with the BMW M3, a 3 Series which became sportier and quicker to match the likes of Porsche and TVR. Mercedes were quick to respond with an AMG line for their cars, which rivals BMW's M division to date. As the 80s moved on to the 90s, the modifying car scene began to pick back up. The 1990s was a time where car modifying went completely mad. New car prices reached an all-time low and cars were truly available to all people. The younger generations would fit fiberglass body kits to their cars and make them into show cars. In-car entertainment became a large thing, and subwoofers and speaker systems were fitted into cars as well to attract attention at car shows. The late 90s car culture can be seen in a Fast and Furious film, a film which is famous for having car culture as a background plot. The film was released in 2001 and is still going strong today. Car culture is climbing rapidly, and it has also become a centre of many people's lives. As the kids of the 90s moved on to the early 2000s, Friday nights at shopping centres were bustling with life as people came to show their highly modified prized possessions. The scene was started to be documented, and people began to get more and more interested into owning their own personalised car rather than drive around any old car. The scene from then on hasn't slowed down, nor does it show any signs of slowing down. With social media flooded with modified cars and the community no longer confined to a city or state, the car community is now worldwide. All the different sectors join together at car shows. Currently, stance is a common modifying trend as well as track. Track is basically making a car that would perform well on track but use it on road. There are large lifestyle brands nowadays which rely heavily on the car culture, such as Stance Nation and the British Roll Hard brand. These brands choreograph many car shows throughout the show season. In conclusion, I personally believe that the car culture is never going to be dead. The culture is still growing, the world is still moving along to adapt and change with the car. It is that keeps the community alive. With arguably a flat spot happening during the 80s, car culture has since then grown exponentially. Over the years, it has been spread across the age groups and thus making it one of the largest communities in the world.